Good evening, and welcome. The year is 1952. The French Riviera shimmers in late summer heat, its villas draped in bougainvillea, its terraces alive with the laughter of the idle rich. It is, by every appearance, a paradise. But in the Villa Bellombre, there hangs a mirror. An antique, Venetian glass, they say, cracked down the centre as though something inside it tried to escape. The servants refused to look at it after dark. The old woman who brought it from an estate sale in Naples whispered only this: "It does not show you the present. It shows you what is coming." When 3 guests see a woman's death reflected in that mirror, and that same woman is found dead the very next morning in the exact manner foretold, the Riviera's polished surface cracks along with the glass. Scotland Yard is baffled, and the local gendarmerie is superstitious. And somewhere on a sun-drenched terrace, sipping his tisane with characteristic calm, sits Hercule Poirot, the little Belgian with the magnificent moustaches and the even more magnificent mind. He does not believe in cursed mirrors. He does not believe in prophecy. But he does believe, most fervently, in the remarkable ingenuity of the human capacity for wickedness. The mirror on the wall. The Villa Bellombre sat upon a limestone cliff above the Mediterranean, as though it had grown there rather than been built. Its pale stone walls bleached by decades of Riviera sun, its iron balconies trailing jasmine and old rust in equal measure. From the terrace, one could see as far as the Cap d'Antibes on a clear morning, the sea so blue and so still that it seemed painted rather than real. It was, Captain Hastings remarked to me as we arrived, exactly the sort of place where nothing unpleasant ought ever to happen. I should have known from long experience that such observations are invariably followed by something very unpleasant indeed. We had come at the invitation of Madame Sylvie Archambault, a widow of considerable fortune and even more considerable anxiety. Her letter to Poirot had been brief and somewhat confused, as letters written under agitation often are. She had mentioned a mirror. She had mentioned a vision. She had underlined the word terrified twice, and then crossed it out, and then written it again. Poirot had read the letter twice, folded it with great precision along its original creases, and said, "We shall go, mon ami." A woman who crosses out the word terrified and then writes it again. She is not hysterical, she is honest. And so here we were. Madame Archambault received us in the salon, a tall, thin woman of perhaps 60, with grey hair pulled severely from her face, and the careful posture of someone who had spent a lifetime trying to appear unafraid. She wore black still, though her husband had been dead 7 years. Whether this was mourning or simply habit, I could not say. "Monsieur Poirot." She extended her hand. "I am grateful you came. I was not certain you would take me seriously." "Madame," said Poirot, bowing over her hand with the particular gravity he reserved for moments when he wished to be believed, "I take the word terrified always seriously, especially when it is written twice." A faint colour came into her cheeks. She gestured us toward a pair of chairs near the window, and we sat, and she sat across from us, very straight, her hands folded in her lap, as though she were holding herself together by the effort of it. "I must tell you about the mirror," she said. "Please," said Poirot, "from the beginning, leave nothing out, however foolish it may seem." She drew a slow breath. "It came into my possession 3 years ago. I purchased it at an estate sale in Naples, the estate of a contessa whose family had owned it for, they claimed, 2 centuries. The glass is Venetian. Very old, it is cracked, a single crack running diagonally from the upper left corner to the lower right, as though someone struck it once, long ago, with something sharp. She paused. "I bought it because it was beautiful. I did not buy it because of the stories." "What stories?" I asked. She looked at me, and there was something in her expression that I found difficult to name. Not fear exactly, something older than fear. "The Contessa's housekeeper told me, as the mirror was being wrapped for transport, that it had a property. She said that sometimes, in certain lights, at certain hours, the mirror does not reflect what stands before it." Madame Archambault's voice was perfectly steady. That, somehow, made it worse. "It reflects what is coming." The room was very quiet. Outside, through the open window, came the sound of the sea. "I did not believe her, naturally," Madame Archambault continued. "I am not a superstitious woman, Monsieur Poirot. I am the daughter of a physician and the wife of an engineer. I believe in what can be measured and explained. I hung the mirror in the upper gallery, and I thought no more of it. Until," said Poirot, "until 6 nights ago." She unfolded her hands and folded them again. "I had guests staying in the villa, 4 of them. Madame Renée Villette. She is an old friend, a widow also. We have known each other since girlhood. Her nephew, Edouard Villette, a young man of perhaps 30, who paints or claims to. A Dr. Lucien Garnier, who is a physician from Lyon, an acquaintance of my late husband. And Miss Clara Doyle, an Englishwoman, a companion, I suppose one would call her. She reads to me sometimes. She manages correspondence. 6 nights ago," Poirot prompted gently. 6 nights ago, just after dinner, Madame Renée Villette went upstairs to the gallery. She told me afterward that she had gone to look at a small landscape I keep there. She had expressed interest in it at dinner. But when she passed the mirror, she stopped. Madame Archambault's voice dropped slightly. She said she saw not her own reflection, but a scene. A woman lying at the base of the sea steps. The steps that lead from our lower garden down to the water. The woman's face was turned away, but her dress was the particular shade of green that Madame Villette herself had been wearing that evening. I felt a chill that I was rather ashamed of, sitting in a sunlit room on the Riviera. Madame Villette was naturally distressed, continued our hostess. She came to find me at once. She was shaking. I went upstairs with her, and I looked at the mirror myself, and I saw nothing. Only my own reflection, cracked in two by that diagonal line. But then Dr. Garnier came to see what the commotion was, and he looked, and She stopped. "He saw the same thing?" Poirot asked. "He said he saw a woman in green at the base of the steps. He said he could not see her face." Madame Archambault pressed her folded hands against her lips for a moment, then lowered them. "And then Edouard, the nephew, he came also. And he looked, and he went very white. And he said only, 'We must not let her go near the steps.' The sea outside whispered against the cliffs. And Madame Villette," said Poirot. "Since that evening, she has stayed away from the sea steps. She was careful. She was frightened. We all were, in spite of ourselves." A long pause. "But yesterday morning, Monsieur Poirot, at 7 o'clock, one of the garden boys found her, at the base of the sea steps. She was wearing the green dress." Madame Archambault's voice did not waver, but her knuckles had gone white. She was dead. Poirot asked to see the mirror before he asked to see anything else. This was not, I thought, because he believed in its prophetic properties. It was because he believed in beginning at the beginning, and the mirror was where this story had begun. The upper gallery was a long, cool corridor with a terracotta floor and several mediocre landscapes hung at intervals along the wall. The mirror hung at the far end, between 2 narrow windows that framed it like a painting. It was perhaps 4 feet tall and 3 wide, set in a frame of darkened gilt that had once been elaborate and was now merely old. The crack ran exactly as Madame Archambault had described, diagonal, deliberate seeming, from upper left to lower right. The glass on the either side of it was dark with age, the silvering behind it gone patchy and uneven, so that one's reflection came back fragmented, incomplete. I stood before it and looked at my own face, split neatly down the middle by that thin black line. "Cheerful sort of thing," I said. Poirot did not reply. He was standing slightly to one side, and not looking at his own reflection at all, but studying the frame, the wall on either side, the floor beneath. He produced from his pocket the small magnifying lens he sometimes carried, and examined the lower left corner of the frame with the patient attention of a jeweler appraising a stone. "Poirot," I said, "what are you looking for?" "I'm looking," he said, "at what is there." He straightened up. "And also, Hastings, at what is not there." "And what is not there?" He tilted his head slightly, the way he did when a thought was forming itself and was not yet ready to be spoken aloud. "That, mon ami, is a question that requires more information before I can answer it honestly." He turned away from the mirror. "Come, I wish to see the sea steps." The sea steps were carved from the cliff face itself, 22 of them. I counted. It was because counting seemed like the sort of useful, solid thing to do, descending steeply from the lower garden to a small stone landing where a rowing boat was tied. The Mediterranean moved below in long, lazy swells, indifferent to what had happened here. There were chalk marks on the landing from the gendarmerie, and a dark stain on the stone that I looked away from quickly. Poirot stood at the top of the steps for a long moment, looking down. Then he descended slowly, one hand trailing along the iron rail that ran the length of the stairway. I followed. At the bottom, he crouched, with some difficulty, as crouching had never been among his preferred activities, and examined the stone of the landing. He looked at the iron rail. He looked at the lowest step. He stood up again and looked back up at the cliff face, at the villa above, at the angles and sight lines. "The railing," he said, almost to himself. "What about it?" He wrapped his hand around the rail and applied the faintest pressure. It shifted, not dramatically, not dangerously, but it shifted, a millimeter perhaps, with a faint sound of loosened iron in old stone. Poirot said nothing, but his eyes, when he looked at me, were no longer merely curious. They were grave. "Come," he said again, "I wish very much to speak with the nephew." The prophecy. Edouard Villette was not what I had expected. I had formed, from Madame Archambault's brief description, a picture of the young artist as a certain type. The careless, decorative sort one finds scattered along the Riviera, like dropped cigarettes. Young men of small talent and large self-regard who painted in different watercolors and borrowed money with great charm. The Riviera was full of them. I had met a dozen at least. Edouard was not that. He was tall, leanly built, with his late aunt's dark coloring and none of her softness. He had the kind of face that would have been handsome if it had been less guarded. Sharp cheekbones, dark eyes set rather deep, a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten some years ago how to be entirely at ease. He was perhaps 32, as though something about him suggested a man who had been older than his age for quite some time. He received us in the small sitting room off the main hall, standing when we entered, and remaining standing until Poirot, with a small gesture, invited him to sit. He had a sketchbook on the table beside him, closed. His hands, I noticed, were very still. "Monsieur Villette," said Poirot pleasantly, settling into the chair across from him with the air of a man who intended to stay a while. "I am grateful for your time. I understand this has been a most distressing few days." "My aunt is dead," said Edouard. His voice was flat and careful, like a road with the ice not yet fully thawed. "Distressing is perhaps a small word for it. You were fond of her." A pause, not a long one, but a considered one. "She was my father's sister. She was kind to me when I was young. After my father died, yes, I was fond of her." "And yet," said Poirot, with no particular emphasis, "you are the one who inherited her estate." The dark eyes moved to Poirot's face and stayed there. "I am aware of how that sounds. I am sure you are. I ask only because it is relevant, you understand, not because I accuse." Poirot's tone was mild, almost apologetic. It was a tone I had learned over many years to be slightly wary of. "Tell me about the evening of the mirror, 6 nights ago. You came upstairs and you looked into the glass and you said, 'We must not let her go near the steps.' Those were your words, yes?" "Yes. What did you see?" Edouard was quiet for a moment. His hands, still folded on his knee, tightened slightly. "I saw my aunt, in the green dress she had worn at dinner. She was lying at the base of the sea steps. I could see her face clearly. The others said they could not, but I could." He stopped. "She looked peaceful, which was somehow worse than if she had looked otherwise." "You could see her face clearly," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "That is interesting. The others could not. I cannot explain it. I only know what I saw. And when you said, 'We must not let her go near the steps,' did you take any action to prevent it? Did you warn her directly, speak to her, suggest that she avoid the lower garden?" Something shifted in Edouard's expression. Barely perceptible, but there. "I spoke to her that evening. I told her I was uneasy about the steps, that the railing seemed unsafe. I suggested she not use them until it had been examined. And her response? She thanked me. She said she would be careful." His jaw tightened. "She was not careful enough." "No," said Poirot gently. "She was not." We found Dr. Garnier on the terrace, sitting in the shade of a canvas awning, with a newspaper folded on his knee and a glass of something cold and untouched on the table beside him. He was a compact grey-haired man of perhaps 55, with the contained, watchful manner of a physician who had delivered a great deal of bad news over a long career and had learned to keep his own feelings somewhere they would not interfere with his usefulness. He had been, Madame Archambault had told us, the one to examine the body. "Dr. Garnier," said Poirot, pulling up a chair with the comfortable assumption that he was welcome, "you have my sympathies. It is a difficult thing to be a physician in such circumstances. You arrive at the scene not as a guest, but as a necessity." Garnier looked at him steadily. "I have attended deaths before, of course, but not, I think, deaths that you had, in some sense, foreseen." A brief silence. The sea glittered beyond the terrace railing. "I saw something in that mirror," said Garnier, in the tone of a man who had decided that denial was not worth the effort. "I do not know what I saw. I'm a man of science, Monsieur Poirot. I do not believe in prophecy. I believe in optics and psychology and the remarkable capacity of a frightened mind to impose meaning on ambiguous stimuli." "Beautifully put," said Poirot. And yet Renée is dead?" He picked up his glass, looked at it, set it down again without drinking. "At the base of the steps, in the green dress." His voice did not change. So either I experienced a genuine premonition, which is impossible, or, Poirot prompted. Garnier looked at him directly. "Or someone arranged for what I saw in that mirror to come true?" Poirot said nothing. He simply looked at the doctor with an expression of quiet approval. The way a schoolmaster looks at a pupil who has, unexpectedly, given precisely the right answer. "That is," said Poirot at last, "a most intelligent observation, Doctor. Most intelligent indeed." I found Poirot that evening before dinner, standing alone in the upper gallery. He was not looking at the mirror. He was standing with his back to it, his hands clasped behind him, staring at the opposite wall. "Poirot," I said, "are you all right?" "I'm thinking, Hastings." "You look as though the mirror is making you uncomfortable." He turned slightly. "It is not the mirror that makes me uncomfortable. It is what the mirror has been made to do." He was quiet for a moment. "Tell me, when you looked into it this afternoon, what did you see?" "My own reflection, cracked in half, nothing unusual." "And did you notice anything about the quality of the reflection? The clarity of it?" I thought back. The glass had been dark, old, uneven. My reflection had been somewhat dim, distorted toward the edges by the age of the silvering. "It was rather murky," I said. "Old glass. One doesn't see oneself very clearly." "No," said Poirot, "one does not." He turned back to look at the mirror for a long moment, and there was an expression on his face that I could not quite read. "That is the point, mon ami. That is precisely the point. I don't follow you." He sighed, not with impatience, but with the particular sigh of a man who has seen a shape in the fog and cannot yet describe it to someone standing farther back. "The mirror is old. The glass is imperfect. In certain lights at certain angles, a reflection would be incomplete, impressionistic. One would see shapes, colors, movement, but not detail." He paused, and yet Edouard Villette saw his aunt's face clearly enough to recognize it beyond any doubt. I stared at him. "You think he's lying?" "I think," said Poirot carefully, "that a man who sees a face clearly where others see only shapes is either gifted with extraordinary vision, or he already knew whose face he would see." The gallery was very still. From somewhere below came the sound of a dinner gong, rich and resonant, rolling through the cool stone corridors of the Via Belombre like a slow tide. Poirot straightened his cuffs, a habitual gesture performed whenever his thoughts had arranged themselves to his satisfaction, and moved toward the stairs. "Come, Hastings," he said, "let us go and dine with a murderer. The players of the Riviera." Dinner at the Villa Belombre was, under the circumstances, a remarkable performance. I use the word performance deliberately, because that is precisely what it was. 4 people sat around a candlelit table, each of them aware, in varying degrees and for varying reasons, that a woman had died on those steps below, and each of them conducting themselves with the particular careful brightness of individuals who have decided, collectively and without discussion, that the evening must proceed as though it had not. The candles were lit, the wine was poured, the fish course arrived and was commented upon. Someone mentioned the weather. Someone else mentioned a gallery opening in Nice. The conversation moved along its prescribed channels with the smooth, determined flow of water that has been redirected around an obstacle it is not permitted to acknowledge. Poirot ate with evident enjoyment and said almost nothing. This was, I had long since learned, when he was at his most attentive. Miss Clara Doyle sat to my left, and I studied her with the rather guilty attention one gives to a person one is attempting to assess without appearing to do so. She was perhaps 28, quietly pretty in the English fashion, fair-haired, grey-eyed, with a composure so thorough that it was difficult at first to read as anything other than blankness. But it was not blankness, I decided, watching her. It was discipline. There was a difference, though it required some attention to notice it. She had been with Madame Archambault for 2 years, according to our hostess. She read aloud. He managed correspondence, accompanied Madame to appointments and exhibitions, performed the dozen quiet tasks that fall to a paid companion without ever quite being named. She was, in the social architecture of the villa, neither guest nor servant, which placed her, rather uncomfortably, in a position that gave her access to everything and belonging to nothing. "You must find it strange," I said to her, during a lull in the general conversation, "being here under these circumstances. A guest of the house whom you also work for, in a sense." She looked at me with the grey eyes, which were, on closer inspection, rather more perceptive than they first appeared. "I find most circumstances strange, Captain Hastings," she said pleasantly. "One learns to adapt." "Did you know Madame Villette well? The deceased?" A slight pause. "Well enough. She visited the villa 3 or 4 times a year. She was fond of Madame Archambault, in her way." "In her way," I repeated. "That is an interesting qualification." Clara Doyle smiled, very slightly, and returned her attention to her plate. She did not elaborate. I had the distinct impression that she had said precisely as much as she intended to say, and that the conversation was, from her perspective, concluded. Renée Villette had been, it emerged over the course of the evening, a woman who inspired complicated feelings in those around her. Madame Archambault spoke of her with the careful warmth of long friendship, the warmth that has survived disagreements and disappointments and the attrition of years, and is therefore more durable, if perhaps less luminous, than newer affections, as they had known each other since the age of 12. There had been once some question of a shared romantic interest, a young man who had eventually married neither of them, and was now, Madame Archambault said with a dry smile, extremely fat and living in Bordeaux. They had remained friends through 2 marriages, 2 widowhoods, and several decades of the ordinary texture of life. She was difficult sometimes, Madame Archambault said, and then seemed to feel that this admission required balancing. But then we are all difficult sometime. Dr. Garnier, I noticed, said very little about the dead woman. He spoke of other things with easy competence: medicine, the political situation, or a paper he was preparing on cardiac irregularities in elderly patients, and deflected any reference to Renée Villette with the smooth efficiency of a man who has practiced deflection until it has become invisible. But once, when Edouard mentioned his aunt's name in passing, I saw Garnier's hand tighten briefly on his wine glass. Just briefly. Then it relaxed, and he took a measured sip, and his expression remained exactly as it had been. I filed this away in the manner Poirot had over the years trained me to file things, without conclusion, without judgment, simply as a fact to be kept and considered later. It was after dinner, when we had moved to the terrace for coffee, and the evening had softened around us into something almost pleasant, that Edouard Villette said something that struck me as oddly placed, as we had been talking, or rather, the others had been talking, about the history of the villa. Madame Archambault was explaining that it had been built in the 1880s by a shipping merchant from Marseille, and had passed through several hands before her husband had purchased it in 1931. There was a story, she said, that the merchant who built it lost his fortune within a decade. People said the land was unlucky. People say that about any land where something unhappy has occurred, said Garnier. It is a way of externalizing misfortune, of insisting that it came from outside rather than from within. Or perhaps, said Edouard quietly, looking out at the dark sea, some places do accumulate a residue of what happens in them over time. There was a small silence, "That is a rather poetic notion," I said. "Oh, for a man who, forgive me, has just lost his aunt under very tragic circumstances." He turned to look at me. I did not say I believed it. I said perhaps. He paused. "There is a difference, Captain Hastings, between believing a thing and acknowledging that one cannot entirely disprove it." It was, I thought, a careful distinction. Almost too careful. Like a man who had thought about exactly this question before and had prepared his answer. Poirot had been silent throughout the terrace conversation, seated slightly apart from the group in a wicker chair, his coffee cup balanced on his knee, his eyes moving from face to face with the unhurried patience of a man watching a play he has seen before and is now noticing the stagecraft rather than the story. When the others drifted inside, Madame Archambault first, then Garnier, and then Clara Doyle, with a quiet good night, I pulled my chair closer to Poirot's. "Well," I said. "Well," he said, "what do you make of them, Hastings? Your impressions? Unfiltered, if you please." I considered. Garnier is hiding something about his relationship with the dead woman. Something personal, I'd say. The way he avoids her name. Edouard is intelligent and guarded, and rather too careful with his words. And Miss Doyle, I paused. Miss Doyle sees rather more than she lets on. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, all of that is correct, I think. And Madame Archambault? Madame Archambault, said Poirot, is genuinely grieving, which is, in itself, interesting. Why interesting? She lost her oldest friend. Yes, but she is also, Hastings, the only one of the four who does not appear to be afraid. I looked at him. Oh, the others are afraid. Garnier is afraid. Edouard is afraid. Miss Doyle is... He tilted his head slightly, watchful in the manner of someone who is afraid, but has decided that watchfulness is more useful than the showing of it. He set his coffee cup down on the small table beside him. When people are afraid after a death, Hastings, it is usually for one of two reasons. Either they fear the same fate, or they fear discovery. And you can't yet tell which it is? Not yet, he admitted, but I will tell you this. Among our four players, there is at least one person who knew before that evening that René Villette would die. The mirror did not show them the future. His voice was quiet, but there was something beneath the quietness. An edge of something I could only describe as controlled anger. Someone showed them a performance. A very carefully arranged performance. And then they made it real. The sea was invisible now in the darkness, but one could hear it far below. The slow, indifferent rhythm of the water against the cliffs. The question, said Poirot, is not what the mirror showed. The question is, who lit the stage? The Death Foretold. The following morning, Poirot asked to speak with the garden boy. His name was Marcel, a thin, sun-browned child of perhaps 15, with the watchful eyes of someone who has learned that adults in large houses notice the furniture more reliably than they notice the people who clean it. He had been the one to find the body, and he had, according to Madame Archambault, not spoken of it to anyone since, which she attributed to shock, and which Poirot attributed to something rather more useful. We found him in the lower garden, raking gravel with the mechanical persistence of someone performing a task in order to have somewhere to put his hands. Poirot approached him without the briskness that adults typically deploy toward children and teenagers, without the unconscious acceleration that signals, I however kindly, that the conversation is expected to be brief. He simply sat down on the low stone wall nearby, as though he had nowhere particular to be, and all the time in the world to get there. Marcel stopped raking. He looked at Poirot with the cautious assessment of a creature that has not yet decided whether the approaching figure is friendly. "You found her," said Poirot. Not a question, and not an accusation, simply an acknowledgement. "Yes, monsieur." "That was a hard thing. I am sorry it fell to you." Marcel said nothing, but something in his shoulders shifted slightly, as though a small weight had been set down. "Will you tell me," said Poirot, "what you saw? Not what you told the gendarmerie, what you actually saw. Everything from the beginning." The boy was quiet for a moment, his hands loose on the rake handle, and then he said, "I came down at 6:30. I come every morning to check the boat. Madame likes the boat kept clean and tied properly. I came down the steps and—" He stopped. "Take your time," said Poirot. "She was already there, at the bottom, on the landing." He spoke carefully, as though the words needed to be placed rather than simply said. "She was on her side. Her face was— she was facing the wall. I could see the green of her dress very clearly. The morning light was— it was very clear that morning." "Was she at the foot of the steps, or further along the landing?" Marcel considered this with a seriousness I found rather touching. "Further along, not at the foot. She was perhaps 4 feet from the bottom step, closer to the edge of the landing, near the waterside." Poirot's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. 4 feet from the bottom step," he repeated. "On the waterside of the landing. Yes, monsieur. And the railing, at the bottom of the steps, where the railing ends. Was there anything about it that you noticed? Anything at all?" Marcel frowned. I thought there were marks. On the stone where the railing post goes in? White marks. Like when the mortar is cracked and the edges go pale." He paused. "But I don't know if they were new. I don't always look at the railing." Poirot thanked him with a gravity that made the boy stand somewhat straighter, and we left him to his gravel. 4 feet from the bottom step, I said. As we walked back up through the lower garden. "Yes," said Poirot. "If she fell, or was pushed, from the steps, she would have landed at the foot of them surely, and not 4 feet away." "One would think so," said Poirot pleasantly, "which means she didn't fall from the steps at all." "Or," said Poirot, "she fell from the steps and was then moved, which raises its own questions about timing and opportunity." He paused on the garden path, looking back down toward the cliff edge. "But yes, Hastings, the position of the body is suggestive. It also means the cause of death may not have been the fall." Poirot looked at me with an expression that, on a less composed face, might have been called pleased. "You are this morning in excellent form, mon ami." "Yes. The gendarmerie have concluded, somewhat hastily I think, that she fell, struck her head on the landing stone, and died. Dr. Garnier, who examined her, he confirmed that the head injury was consistent with such a fall." "Garnier examined her?" "He was the first to arrive, after Marcel raised the alarm. It is natural. He is a physician. He was in the house." Poirot began walking again slowly. "But it is also, you will agree, a somewhat convenient arrangement." I digested this. "You think Garnier falsified his assessment of the injury?" "I think," said Poirot carefully, "that a physician who is hiding something about his relationship with the deceased, and who is the first to examine her body, and who concludes, quickly and without the benefit of a proper post-mortem, that her death was accidental, deserves to have his conclusions examined with some care." He paused. "I have sent a telegram this morning to a colleague in Nice. A proper examination will be conducted this afternoon. Does Madame Archambault know?" "She knows. She agreed immediately. She is, as I said, genuinely grieving, and genuinely determined to understand what happened. He glanced at me sideways. She is also, I suspect, beginning to be afraid. You said last night she was the only one who wasn't. Last night she was not. This morning, after I spoke with her and explained certain of my observations, she is now. He did not seem troubled by this. Fear in the innocent, Hastings, is not a problem. It is useful. It makes them careful. The afternoon brought the doctor from Nice. A Dr. Pellerin, brisk and methodical and thoroughly unimpressed by the Riviera setting, and the results of his examination arrived at the villa by telephone at 5:30. Poirot took the call in Madame Archambaud's study with the door closed. I waited in the hall with the particular useless energy of someone who wants very much to be helpful and has absolutely nothing to do. When Poirot emerged some 10 minutes later, his expression was composed in the careful way that it became when he had received information that confirmed something he had hoped not to be right about. "Well?" I said. "Renée Villette did not die from striking her head on the landing stone," said Poirot. "She died from a blow to the back of the skull, delivered before she went over the edge. The head injury from the landing was real, but it was secondary. She was already dead, or very nearly, when she fell." He paused. "There was also, Dr. Pellerin tells me, evidence of a sedative compound in her system. Not a large dose. Enough to make a woman drowsy and somewhat unsteady on her feet. The hall was very quiet. So she was drugged," I said, "and then struck, and then put over the edge to make it look like a fall. That is the most probable sequence, yes. Someone in this house killed her. Someone in this house killed her," Poirot agreed. "And someone in this house spent considerable effort ensuring that her death, when it came, would appear to have been predicted, foretold. The work of a cursed mirror rather than of a deliberate human hand." His voice was even, but beneath it I could hear something that was not quite anger and not quite sadness. Something that belonged to both. "It is a very clever plan, Hastings. Truly clever. The superstition provides cover, the prophecy provides distraction. Everyone is so occupied with the question of whether the mirror is supernatural that no one stops to ask whether the scene was arranged. But who arranged it, and how?" Poirot was quiet for a moment. "The how, I believe I understand largely. The mirror itself, I need to examine it once more this evening, in the particular light that the witnesses described. The who?" He stopped. Then, unusually, he said something that I did not expect. "I am not yet certain, Hastings. I have a strong inclination in one direction, but I have been wrong before when I followed strong inclinations without sufficient evidence. And this..." He looked toward the staircase, toward the upper gallery where the mirror hung. "This is not a case where being wrong is acceptable." It was, I thought, one of the rare moments when Poirot allowed himself to be seen being uncertain. He was not, despite the legend that had grown around him, infallible. He was simply, most of the time, right, and the difference between those two things mattered very much to him. "What do we do now?" I asked. "Now," said Poirot, "we wait for this evening, and we watch very carefully who is afraid of the dark." That evening, after dinner, Poirot announced to the assembled household that he intended to conduct what he called a small experiment. The announcement was made with perfect casualness, over the remnants of dessert, in the tone of a man proposing a pleasant after-dinner diversion, rather than a calculated provocation. He would, he said, like each member of the household to accompany him, one at a time, to the upper gallery, and to stand before the mirror in the same conditions, the same hour, the same lamp left burning at the end of the corridor. as had existed 6 nights ago. "I am curious," he said pleasantly, "whether the mirror will oblige us with another vision." There was a silence around the table. I watched the 4 faces. Garnier was very still. Edouard reached for his wineglass and then did not drink from it. Clara Doyle looked at Poirot with the grey eyes that saw rather more than they showed. Madame Archambault folded her hands in her lap. "If you think it will help," said Madame Archambault. "I think," said Poirot, with the pleasant smile that meant he was thinking something quite different from what he was saying, "that it will be most instructive." Poirot's doubt. The experiment, as Poirot called it, began at 9 o'clock. The upper gallery was lit as he had specified, a single oil lamp burning at the far end of the corridor near the mirror, casting a warm and unsteady light that moved slightly in the draught from the narrow windows. The effect was, I will admit, rather unsettling. The old house settled around us with its customary evening sounds, the creak of cooling stone, the distant breath of the sea, and the lamp threw long shadows down the terracotta floor that shifted and retreated with each small movement of the flame. Poirot stood to one side, near the wall, where he was visible but not intrusive. I stood beside him. We had agreed that I would not speak during the individual sessions unless directly addressed, which was, in my experience, Poirot's way of ensuring that the atmosphere he had carefully constructed was not accidentally dismantled by my tendency to fill silences with words. Madame Archambault went first, at her own insistence. She walked the length of the gallery with her customary straight-backed composure and stood before the mirror for perhaps a minute. Her reflection gazed back at her from the darkened, uneven glass, fragmented by the crack, dimmed by age, her face reduced to a pale impression of itself in the uncertain lamplight. She turned away without speaking and walked back to us. "Nothing," she said, simply, without drama. "Only myself." Poirot nodded. "Thank you, madame. Would you be so kind as to wait downstairs?" Dr. Garnier came next. He walked to the mirror with the deliberate pace of a man approaching something he has decided to treat as beneath concern. He stood before it. I watched his back, straight, controlled, the shoulders set with professional composure. He stood there for perhaps 90 seconds. Then something happened that I very nearly missed. His right hand, hanging at his side, closed slowly into a fist. Not a dramatic gesture, not the sudden clench of shock or fear, but the slow, involuntary tightening of a man who is seeing something he did not expect to see, and is exercising very considerable effort not to show it. He turned around. His face was composed. "Nothing of note," he said. Poirot looked at him for a moment with the mild, attentive expression that gave nothing away. "Thank you, Doctor." Garnier left. His footsteps on the terracotta were very even. I looked at Poirot. He gave the smallest shake of his head, "Not now," and I said nothing. Clara Doyle came third. She stood before the mirror for a long moment, her back to us, her fair hair pale in the lamplight. She was very still, stiller, I thought, than the others had been. Not the stillness of composure, exactly. The stillness of someone listening. When she turned around, her expression was difficult to read. It was not frightened. It was something more complicated than frightened. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Is this experiment, is it genuinely about the mirror? Or is it about watching us look at it?" There was a pause. Then Poirot smiled. Not the pleasant social smile, but the real one, small and warm and slightly rueful. "You are," he said, A most perceptive young woman, Miss Doyle. I'll take that as confirmation." She looked at him steadily. "What did you see when you watched the others?" "That," said Poirot gently, "I am not yet in a position to share, but I will tell you this. What you have just asked me is the correct question, and the fact that you asked it suggests to me that you already suspect the answer." Clara Doyle looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Be careful, Monsieur Poirot. Whoever did this is not finished being careful themselves." She walked back down the gallery and down the stairs, and her footsteps, unlike Garnier's, were almost silent. Edouard Villette came last. He stood at the entrance to the gallery for a moment before approaching the mirror, not hesitating exactly, but taking what seemed to be a considered breath. Then he walked forward with his long, measured stride and stopped before the glass. I watched him carefully. He stood there for nearly 2 minutes. His posture was upright, his hands loose at his sides. His reflection looked back at him from the cracked glass. And here was the thing that struck me, though I could not immediately explain why it struck me. He looked directly into the mirror. Not at his own reflection, but beyond it, into the darkened depths of the old glass, as though he was looking for something specific, or checking that something specific was still there. He turned around. His dark eyes moved to Poirot's face and stayed there, and there was between them a moment of the particular silence that exists between two people who are each aware that the other knows more than they are saying. "Anything?" said Poirot pleasantly. "Nothing," said Edouard. "Only my own reflection." "Quite so," said Poirot. "Thank you, Monsieur Villette." Afterward, Poirot and I sat in the small study that Madame Archambault had placed at his disposal, and I waited while he arranged his thoughts in the manner I had grown so familiar with over the years, the absolute stillness, the eyes unfocused, the occasional small movement of one hand, as though he were sorting invisible objects into invisible categories. The lamp on the desk threw a steady yellow light. Outside, the sea. "Tell me what you observed," said Poirot without preliminary. "Garnier saw something," I said. "His hand." He closed his fist. "Yes, Edouard was looking for something in the glass. Not at his reflection, beyond it. As though he was checking on something. Yes. Very good, Hastings. What else?" "Clara Doyle," I paused. "Clara Doyle is not what she appears. She's too sharp for a paid companion." "She is considerably too sharp," Poirot agreed. "I have, in fact, been thinking about Miss Doyle rather carefully since yesterday. Her position in the household gives her access to rooms, to routines, to the private arrangements of the villa, to information about the guests." He was quiet for a moment. "She knows where things are kept. She knows who goes where and at what time. She knows the habits of the house. You suspect her. I suspect everyone, Hastings. That is the correct position at this stage." He paused. But I will tell you where my thinking has been leading me, with the caveat that I am not certain, and that I have, in the past, been led in a direction by my instincts, and arrived at entirely the wrong conclusion." He said this without apparent embarrassment, which was one of the things I had always respected about him. He was not too proud to remember his mistakes. I once, in Brussels, became completely convinced that a bank manager was responsible for the disappearance of 40,000 francs. I was wrong. The money had been taken by his wife, who had hidden it in a hatbox, for reasons I still find somewhat puzzling. I smiled. "I remember you mentioning that." "The point is not the hatbox," said Poirot with mild dignity. "The point is that certainty arrived at too early is simply a comfortable error. I am not certain. I have a direction, but I am missing something. What are you missing?" He pressed his fingertips together. The mechanism of the mirror. I understand the broad intention. Someone wanted the death to appear foretold, to appear supernatural, to ensure that when René Villette died, the minds of the witnesses would go to prophecy and curse rather than to murder. That is the design. He leaned forward slightly. But the mirror itself, the visions that 3 people claim to have seen, there must be a mechanism, a physical, explicable mechanism, and I have not yet found it. Could they simply be lying? All 3 of them, making up the visions to support an alibi of sorts? All 3 conspiring together, you mean? Yes, it is possible. But it would require a remarkable degree of coordination and trust between 3 people with, as far as I can determine, no prior relationship strong enough to sustain such a conspiracy. He shook his head slightly. No, I believe they saw something. I believe the mirror was prepared, arranged, in some way that I have not yet fully understood. He stood up from the desk and went to the window, looking out at the dark garden and the darker sea beyond it. There is also, he said after a moment, the question of the sedative. How it was administered. Yes, René Villette was a careful woman, by all accounts, not given to accepting food or drink from strangers. She had been warned, by Edouard, to be cautious near the steps. And yet she was drugged, and she died. He turned from the window, which means the sedative was given to her by someone she trusted, someone whose offer of a drink, a late-night tisane, a glass of something, would not have alarmed her. He paused. That narrows it considerably. Madame Archambault, I said. She was René's oldest friend. Yes. You said she was genuinely grieving. I did. He met my eyes, and I believe that is true. But grief and guilt are not, Hastings, mutually exclusive. One can grieve enormously for a person one has harmed. The human heart is, he searched for the word, remarkably capacious in its contradictions. I sat with this for a moment. It was not a comfortable thought. But then, I said slowly, if Madame Archambault administered the sedative, why would she invite you here? Why write that letter? Poirot looked at me with an expression that was almost fond. That, he said, is the question that is currently preventing me from concluding anything at all. He moved back to the desk and sat down heavily, not with exhaustion, but with the particular weight of a man carrying several lines of thought simultaneously and finding them, temporarily, irreconcilable. A guilty person inviting Hercule Poirot to investigate is either very stupid or very cunning. Madame Archambault is manifestly not stupid, which means either she's innocent, I said, or she's so confident in the plan that she thought inviting you would actually strengthen the appearance of innocence. Or, said Poirot, and he said it slowly, as though he was not entirely pleased with the thought, she invited me because she is frightened, not of being caught, but because she knows who did it, and she is afraid of them. The lamp flickered once, it briefly, in a breath of air from somewhere. I think, said Poirot, after the small silence that followed, that tomorrow I must ask Madame Archambault a question I have been postponing. I have been postponing it because the answer may complicate everything I currently believe. And I do not, he paused, with a self-awareness that was coming from him rather unexpected. Always manage the complication of my beliefs with as much grace as I should. It is a vanity, perhaps. The little grey cells do not enjoy being wrong. I looked at him. In the lamplight, he looked older than usual, or perhaps simply tired, which was rarer. He was, I sometimes forgot, not a young man. The Riviera sun had not been entirely kind to him. and the accumulation of human wickedness that passed through his life, case by case, year by year, left marks that were not always visible, but were, I suspected, always present. "You'll get there," I said. It was not a particularly eloquent reassurance, but I meant it, and he knew I meant it, which was sufficient. He straightened his cuffs. The familiar gesture restored slightly, the familiar impression of invincibility. "Yes," he said, I will get there, but I will get there correctly, Hastings, not quickly, correctly." He rose from the chair. "Go to bed. Tomorrow will require a clear head from both of us, particularly mine. The web of fear." The morning came in grey, not the sharp, clarifying grey of an English autumn, but the soft, close grey of the Mediterranean when a weather system moves in from the south. A sky the colour of old pewter, pressing down on a sea that had lost, overnight, all its blue and become instead a flat, heaving silver. The jasmine on the balconies hung limp. The light was the kind that flattens everything, removes shadow and depth, makes the world look like a painting done from memory rather than from observation. It matched, I thought, the mood of the villa. I came down to breakfast to find that Poirot had already been up for some time. He had eaten, the evidence of a demolished brioche and an empty coffee cup, and had apparently gone out, because his light jacket was missing from the hook by the front door, and there was a faint trace of his particular pomade on the air near the entrance, the way a room remembers a person who has recently left it. He returned at 8:30, while I was still at the breakfast table, and he came in from the garden door with his jacket slightly damp at the shoulders, and a look about him that I associated with mornings when the little grey cells had been at work since before dawn. He sat down, poured himself a fresh coffee, and said without preamble, "I have been to see the sea steps again, in this light, and I have found what I was looking for." "The mechanism," I said, "the mechanism." He curled both hands around the coffee cup. "It is, as the best solutions always are, entirely simple. I should have seen it sooner. I am not pleased with myself for the delay." "What is it?" He held up one hand. "All in good time. First I must speak with Madame Archambault, and then, this evening, I will speak with everyone, together." He looked at me over the rim of his cup. "I want you to do something for me this morning, Hastings. Something that will require your particular gift." "What gift?" "Your gift," said Poirot, with the faint, affectionate smile that softened the edge of what he was about to say, for being entirely unthreatening. "People speak to you, mon ami, because you look like a man who will not do anything alarming with what they tell you. It is a social quality of considerable investigative usefulness." I was not certain this was entirely a compliment, but I let it pass. "What do you want me to do?" "Speak to Clara Doyle, informally. Not as an interrogation, simply as a conversation. She has something she wants to say. I saw it last night when she asked me that question in the gallery. She is deciding whether to say it." He set down his cup. "She needs, I think, a little encouragement, and someone who looks like he will not do anything alarming." I found Clara Doyle in the library, which was a small book-lined room at the back of the villa that caught neither the sea view nor the garden aspect, and was therefore, on a social morning, likely to be empty of everyone except someone who had specifically chosen to be alone. She was sitting in the window seat with a book open on her knee, but she was not reading it. She was looking at the grey garden, and she did not hear me come in, which told me that her thoughts were somewhere considerably further away than the middle distance. "Miss Doyle," I said. She turned. For just a fraction of a second, before the composure reassembled itself, I saw something in her face that was very close to relief. "Captain Hastings," she closed the book, "I was wondering when someone would come." I sat down in the chair across from her. "Poirot thought you might want to talk." "Poirot," she said with a complicated expression, "is a very perceptive man." She looked down at the closed book in her lap for a moment, then back up at me. "I have been trying to decide since yesterday evening whether what I know is enough to be useful, whether it changes anything, or whether it simply makes things worse. In my experience," I said, "withholding things from Poirot invariably makes them worse." A small, involuntary smile. "Yes, I suspected as much." She took a breath. "I will tell you what I know, and then you can decide whether to tell him or whether I should. Tell me." She was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts with the careful economy of someone who chooses words precisely. "I have been with Madame Archambault for 2 years. In that time I have observed her guests, her correspondence, her household. Not intrusively, it is simply the nature of the position. One is present, one notices things." She paused. "6 months ago, I became aware that Dr. Garnier and Madame Renée Villette had a history, not a current one, a past one, from some years before. A romantic history. I believe so. I'm not certain of the details, but I found, by accident, a letter. I was sorting Madame Archambault's correspondence, and the letter had been placed with it in error, or perhaps left there deliberately, I cannot say. It was from Renée Villette to Madame Archambault, several years old. In it, Renée mentioned Garnier by his first name, Lucien, in a context that suggested they had been close, and that the ending of that closeness had been painful, and that Renée held him responsible for something specific, though she did not name it directly. What sort of something? From the context, Clara Doyle hesitated. I believe a child was involved, or the loss of one. The language was oblique, but the grief behind it was not. She looked at me steadily. "And then 3 weeks ago, Garnier arrived at the villa for this visit. I watched them together. They were civil, carefully. Precisely civil, in the way that people are when they have agreed, in advance and wordlessly, to treat the past as though it does not exist." She paused. "But once, just once, I saw them alone together on the lower terrace. I was coming through the garden, and they did not see me. Garnier was speaking to her in a low voice, and whatever he was saying, she was shaking her head. Repeatedly, the way one shakes one's head when one will not be persuaded. Could you hear what was said? Only 3 words. I did not intend to listen. I moved away immediately. But I heard Renée say quite clearly before I was out of range. She looked at me. "Not for you." The grey light from the window lay across the floor between us. "Not for you," I repeated. "Not for you." She folded her hands on the closed book. I do not know what he was asking. I do not know what she refused. But she refused it absolutely, and he was not a man who accepted that easily. I could see it in the set of his shoulders as I walked away. I relayed this to Poirot in the study, immediately and in full. He listened without interrupting, which was itself significant. Poirot's silences during a report were calibrated things. He interrupted when something surprised him. He did not interrupt when what he was hearing was confirming, piece by piece, something he had already begun to construct. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Not for you," he repeated. "Yes." He stood up from the desk. "I need to speak with Madame Archambault now. Will you find her for me?" "Of course, Poirot. Is Garnier the one? Is he the killer?" Poirot looked at me with the expression he wore when a question was almost right but not quite. "Garnier is central," he said carefully. "But there is still the question of the mirror. Garnier is a physician from Lyon. He is not," he searched for the phrase, "a man of theatrical imagination. The mirror is theatrical. The mirror required planning and knowledge of this specific household and access to the villa in the days before the death. He paused. Garnier arrived 3 weeks ago for this visit. The mirror has been in this villa for 3 years. I stared at him. You're saying Garnier didn't plan it alone? I am saying, said Poirot, that the mirror required someone who had been here long enough to understand it, to study it, to know precisely what it would do in that particular light. He met my eyes. Oh, someone who has been in this household for 2 years. The words settled into the quiet room, like stones dropped into still water. Clara, I said, Clara Doyle. Or, said Poirot, and his voice was very careful, someone who has been watching Clara Doyle very closely, and who has used her access, her knowledge, her position, without her knowing it. He moved toward the door. This is what I have been missing, Hastings. Not who, but how many. The conversation with Madame Archambault lasted 40 minutes behind the closed study door. I did not hear it. I waited in the hall for the second time in 2 days with the useless restlessness of a man kept from a room where the important things are being said. A clock on the hall table ticked. The sea outside was muffled by the closed windows. When Poirot emerged, he looked different and not shaken exactly. But the careful composure had a quality of recently having been tested, like a wall after a storm has passed. He closed the study door gently behind him. Is she all right? I asked. She will be. He straightened his jacket. She has told me what I needed to know, and I have told her what she needed to hear. He looked at me, and the look was grave and steady and clear. I know now, Hastings, all of it. All of it. The mirror, the sedative, the arrangement of the body, the motive, he paused, and the person, or rather, the persons. Because there are 2 of them, though one is guilty of murder, and one is guilty only of a catastrophic failure of judgment that they will spend a considerable time regretting. Who? Tonight, he said. I will tell you all of it tonight. With everyone present. He began moving toward the stairs. There is still one thing I must confirm. A practical detail that I have been putting off because confirmation will remove the last possibility that I am wrong. He paused on the first step, and because, once confirmed, it will be sad. I find I am not particularly in a hurry to remove that last possibility. It was, I thought, one of the most honest things I had ever heard him say. The afternoon passed in the particular suspended tension of a house that is waiting for something without quite knowing what it is waiting for. Garnier read on the terrace and did not turn his pages. Edouard sat in the sitting room with his sketchbook open and did not draw. Clara Doyle moved quietly through the villa, performing her usual tasks, and if her movements had a slight additional precision about them, the carefulness of someone who is paying close attention to where they are and what they are doing, nobody remarked upon it. I took a walk along the cliff path and tried to think. The sea below was still pewter grey, the horizon invisible in the flat light. A fishing boat moved slowly in the middle distance, purposeful and small against the scale of the water. I stood and watched it for a while and thought about mirrors and what it meant to show someone a death that had not happened yet, except that it had, in a sense, already happened in the mind of the person who arranged it. The death had been planned. The mirror had simply been made into an announcement, a very cold-blooded announcement. I thought about Renée Villette, a woman I had never met, a face seen only in the small framed photograph on the side table in the salon. A woman in her 50s with a composed expression and clever eyes and apparently, a past that someone had decided made her expendable. I thought about the green dress, and I found, standing on the cliff path with the grey sea below and the grey sky above, that I was angry. Not in the hot, immediate way that anger usually comes. In the cooler, more settled way that comes from understanding, with some clarity, the dimensions of what someone has done. I turned around and walked back to the villa. Tonight, Poirot would lay it all out. All of it. And the mirror would reflect nothing more sinister than the faces of those who had used it. That at least was something. The face in the mirror Poirot chose the salon. Not the upper gallery, though several of us had half expected it, had expected the theatrical gesture of gathering beneath the mirror itself, the cracked glass presiding over its own unmasking. But Poirot was not, at his core, a theatrical man. He was a precise one. And precision, on this particular evening, required a room with good lighting, comfortable chairs, and enough space for 5 people to sit without the proximity that breeds either comfort or escape. The salon was arranged by Madame Archambault with a quiet efficiency that suggested she had been expecting the request. 5 chairs in a rough semicircle. The lamps lit against the early dark. The grey afternoon had deepened by 7 o'clock into a proper overcast evening, the sea invisible beyond the windows, and the villa enclosed in its own warm light like a ship in fog. We assembled at 8:30. Madame Archambault sat to the left, upright in her customary fashion, her hands folded. Beside her, Clara Doyle, still and watchful as she had been throughout, grey eyes moving briefly to Poirot's face as he entered and then settling into a composed attention. Dr. Garnier had chosen the chair furthest from the door, which I noted without immediately knowing what to make of it. Edouard Villette sat with his long legs extended and his arms crossed, in the posture of a man who is performing relaxation rather than experiencing it. I sat to Poirot's right, slightly back, in the position I had occupied at so many of these gatherings over the years, witness, recorder, the man slightly out of frame. Poirot stood before us for a moment without speaking, yet he did not do this for effect. He did it because he was, I knew, making a final internal check, running through the architecture of what he was about to say with the thoroughness of an engineer inspecting a structure before committing weight to it. Satisfied, he clasped his hands lightly behind his back. "I wish to thank you all," he began, "for your patience over these several days. I am aware that the circumstances have been distressing. I am aware also that my presence and my questions have added a particular discomfort to what was already a painful situation. I do not apologize for this. The questions were necessary, but I acknowledge it." Nobody spoke. I will tell you now what happened, not what the mirror showed, but what was done, by whom, and why, and how. He paused. And I ask that you allow me to speak without interruption until I have finished. What I have to say is complicated. It is made more complicated by the fact that it involves not one guilty person, but 2, though their guilt is not equivalent. And the law will, I think, treat them very differently. I felt, rather than saw, a slight movement from Garnier's direction. The smallest shift of weight. "We begin," said Poirot, "not 6 days ago, but considerably further back. We begin with a history. Dr. Lucien Garnier and Madame Renée Villette had, some 15 years ago, a relationship of some intimacy. This ended badly, as such relationships sometimes do, and it ended specifically with a loss, a child who did not survive. The circumstances of that loss, who bore responsibility, who failed whom in the aftermath, were a source of grief and of blame that never entirely resolved itself between them. Garnier's face had gone very still. He did not look at Poirot. He looked at his own hands, resting on his knees with the excessive care of objects placed on a surface that might shift. They did not see each other for many years. And then, 3 weeks ago, they found themselves guests in the same villa. Garnier had been invited by Madame Archambault, who was unaware of this history, or was aware of only a part of it. Renée Villette was here as she was here every summer. It was perhaps coincidence, or perhaps Garnier arranged the invitation with a particular purpose. Poirot's voice was even, giving nothing away about his own view of this. In any case, they met, and Garnier asked Renée Villette for something that she refused. The room was very quiet. What he asked her, said Poirot, was for her silence, specifically her silence regarding a matter that, if it became known, would destroy his medical career and his reputation entirely. I will not detail that matter here. It is sufficient to say that it related to the child they had lost, and to a decision made by Garnier in his professional capacity that should never have been made in a personal one. Renée Villette had known of this for years. She had, until now, kept silent. But something had changed. She had recently decided to speak. To whom and why now? Those are questions whose answers died with her. He paused. She refused him. He understood that the refusal was final. A log shifted in the fireplace. The sound was very loud. And so Garnier decided that she must die. The words fell flat and plain into the room, but he is an intelligent man, a careful man. He understood that a woman dying in suspicious circumstances, in a house where she was a known guest, with a physician present who had a grievance against her, this would be examined very closely. He needed her death to appear accidental, and he needed something more, something that would occupy the minds of the witnesses so thoroughly with the supernatural that the natural would be overlooked. Poirot turned slightly. For this, he needed help. He needed someone who knew the villa, who knew the mirror, who had access to every room, every routine, every detail of the household. Poirot's eyes moved to Clara Doyle. Miss Doyle. Clara did not flinch. She looked back at him with the grey eyes, steady and clear, and said nothing. Miss Doyle did not know, said Poirot quietly. I want to be entirely clear on this point because it matters. She did not know what Garnier intended. She was led to believe, that what he asked of her was a prank, a theatrical game. He told her that he and Renée Villette had an old quarrel, a silly one, and that he wished to frighten her slightly as a form of reconciliation. A shared fright, he suggested, sometimes resolves old tensions. He told Miss Doyle that he knew of the mirror's reputation, and that with her help, he wished to arrange a small illusion. Clara's composure had not broken, but something behind it had shifted. Her eyes were very bright. She agreed, said Poirot, because she is intelligent and curious and, I think, somewhat bored by the quietness of her position here, because it seemed harmless, and because Garnier, who is a persuasive man, made it seem not merely harmless, but kind. He turned away from her gently, giving her the privacy of his back. She told him about the mirror's particular properties in low lamplight. She told him about the old silvering at the back of the glass, patchy, uneven, in certain areas almost transparent. She told him that behind the mirror there is a recess in the wall, a small space built originally to house the chimney flue from the floor below, disused for 40 years, behind the mirror's backing, accessible if one removed the mirror from the wall, from the inside of a small cupboard in the adjacent room. I was, I confess, a step behind. "Ye, the mirror was a screen," said Poirot. "That is all. The silvering on the back of the glass is in the lower left quadrant entirely gone. In low lamplight, from the front, it looks like discoloration, like the natural degradation of old glass. But from behind, with a small light source placed correctly in the recess, I saw it, suddenly and completely. You could project an image through the glass." "A silhouette," said Poirot. "No more than that. A figure in a green dress, green being a colour that reads clearly as a distinct shade, even in dimmed and coloured light, positioned as though lying at the base of the sea steps. The figure was a simple construction. Cloth over a wire frame. No detail, no face. Held in place by Garnier, standing in the recess behind the wall on the evening in question, while each witness came to the mirror in turn." He paused. Edouard Villette was the exception. All eyes moved to Edouard. He had uncrossed his arms. He was sitting very still. "Monsieur Villette," said Poirot, "did not see a silhouette. He saw his aunt's face clearly. He knew whose face it was beyond any doubt, because he was not looking at a projection, but at a memory." Poirot's voice was measured but very firm. He knew. Before that evening, he knew. Not because he had seen the future, because Garnier had told him. The fire in the grate was the only sound. "Garnier needed one more thing that Miss Doyle could not provide," said Poirot. "Access to René Villette's evening drink. Madame Villette was a careful woman. She would not accept anything from Garnier himself. She did not trust him, and he knew it. But she trusted her nephew, her late brother's son, who had been kind to her, who had warned her about the steps, who brought her, on the evening before her death, a tisane that she drank because he was family and she had no reason to refuse." He looked at Edouard. "You dissolved the sedative in the tisane. She slept heavily. She woke before dawn, groggy and unsteady, and went, perhaps for air, perhaps disturbed by the drug's effect on her sleep, to the lower garden. And there, Garnier was waiting. Edouard's face had gone the colour of the grey sea outside. The railing had been partially loosened in advance by Garnier, who had examined the steps the day prior under the pretence of concern for their safety. He struck her from behind with a smooth-sided instrument, a particular type of surgical mallet which Dr. Pellerin's examination identified by the shape of the wound, and she fell. And then she was moved slightly to make the scene more consistent with a fall from the steps themselves. And Garnier went back to his room and waited for Marcel to find her in the morning, and presented himself as the obvious man to examine the body. Poirot paused. It was, as I said at the beginning, a clever plan. Genuinely clever. The mirror provided the superstition provided the distraction provided the cover. His voice hardened very slightly, almost imperceptibly. What it did not provide was an explanation for why Edouard Villette saw his aunt's face clearly in a silhouette that had no face. The silence was absolute. "What did Garnier promise you?" Poirot asked Edouard directly. The question was quiet, almost gentle. The inheritance, presumably. Your aunt's estate. She had no children. You were the natural heir, but she had, I think, expressed reservations about you in recent years. Had she threatened to change her will?" Edouard said nothing for a long moment. Then, very quietly, "She had changed it 6 months ago. There was a situation, debts, she disapproved." His voice was flat, emptied. "Garnier found out. He came to me before the visit. He said," he stopped. "He made it seem like a solution. He made it seem," he stopped again, his jaw moved. "He's very persuasive. Yes, said Poirot. "He is." Garnier had not moved. He had not spoken. He sat in his chair with the contained composure of a man who has decided, somewhere in the last 5 minutes, that composure is the only thing he has left and intends to keep it. "Doctor, Garnier," said Poirot, "I have nothing to ask you. I have a statement to make. The evidence is sufficient. Dr. Pellerin's post-mortem report, the surgical mallet which was found this afternoon at the base of the cliff, where it had been dropped into the water, but the water here is clear and not deep, and the gendarmerie are thorough when properly directed. The partial dissolution of the mirror's backing, and the marks in the adjacent cupboard from the wire frame, and the testimony of Miss Doyle, who arranged an illusion and did not understand until too late what it had been used for." He looked at the doctor steadily. "The gendarmerie are outside. They have been outside since 7:30. Garnier closed his eyes. It was the first movement he had made in several minutes. He closed them and kept them closed, and for the duration of perhaps 3 breaths. Then he opened them again, and the composure was still there, but changed, the way a mask is still a mask. Even after the face behind it has accepted that it will be removed. "I see," he said. His voice was perfectly even. It was, in its way, the most chilling thing I had heard in several days. "I see." They took Garnier at 9 o'clock. Edouard Villette was taken separately 20 minutes later, pale and silent, his sketchbook left open on the sitting-room table. And I glanced at it as he was led out and saw that the page was covered, not with a drawing, but with the same word written over and over in small cramped letters, as though he had been doing it without noticing. "Sorry. Clara Doyle sat with Madame Archambault after it was over, the 2 of them close together on the salon sofa, in a silence that needed no words. Madame Archambault was not weeping. She sat very straight as she always sat, and stared at the middle distance with the expression of a woman who is rearranging, very carefully, her understanding of the last several days. I stepped out onto the terrace. The evening had cleared, as Riviera evenings sometimes do after a grey day, the cloud pulling back to reveal a sky thick with stars and a sea that had recovered in the dark its depth and its movement. The air smelled of salt and jasmine. From somewhere along the cliff path came the sound of a nightjar, repetitive and dry. Poirot came out and stood beside me. We were quiet for a while. "The mirror," I said at last. "It'll just hang there now, in the gallery, knowing what it was used for." "It is a piece of glass, Hastings," said Poirot. "It knows nothing. It was made to know nothing, and it succeeded admirably." He paused. "It is we who know. That is the burden and the use of having little grey cells." "Will Madame Archambault keep it, do you think?" "I think she will have it taken down tomorrow morning and placed in the furthest possible storage." He tilted his head slightly. "Or perhaps she will keep it. She is a more resilient woman than she looks, and there is something to be said for keeping the reminder close, the reminder that even a very familiar house can hide something one has not thought to look for." I considered this. "You nearly went wrong, didn't you? You said it yourself. You were missing something." "I was missing Miss Doyle's role. I saw her access and her knowledge, and I placed her, briefly, in the wrong position in the arrangement." He was quiet for a moment. "I considered, for approximately 1 hour yesterday afternoon, whether she was the architect rather than the instrument. I was wrong. It is not comfortable being wrong, even temporarily." He said it simply, without the self-deprecation that sometimes shades into performance. "I do not enjoy it, but I think it is important to know that one can be wrong. It keeps one honest. You got there in the end. I got there, he agreed, but Renée Villette deserved someone who got there faster. He said it quietly, without drama, looking out at the sea. She always does, the victim. She deserves faster. One does one's best, and one's best is, regrettably, not always prompt enough. He was still for a moment. That is the part of this work that no one talks about very much. Not the cleverness of the solution, the weight of the time it takes to arrive at it. The nightjar called again from the darkness of the cliff path. I thought about Renée Villette, the composed face in the photograph, the woman who had refused firmly and finally to give a dishonest man what he wanted, who had said to the wrong person on a sunlit terrace, "Not for you," and had not known what those words would cost her. She was brave, I said, in her way. Yes, said Poirot. She was, and she was right, and it did not save her. He turned from the railing. Come inside, Hastings. Madame Archambault will want company this evening, and there is, I believe, a rather good cognac in the study that she offered earlier, and that I intend to accept. I followed him in from the terrace, from the stars and the salt air and the sound of the sea. Behind us, the Mediterranean moved on in the darkness, indifferent and enormous, as it had moved before any of this had happened, and would move long after every trace of it was gone. Inside the Villa Belombre, a mirror hung in an upstairs gallery, cracked, old, dark with age, and reflected nothing but the empty corridor and the last guttering of a lamp that had almost burned itself out. Just glass, just a reflection, nothing more,